Ladies and gentlemen, now we're going to turn the microphone over to Mr. Dave Nelson, who is going to be talking about his version of railroad mayhem.
Do we need to talk? Oh, it's now working? Okay. So my involvement in this particular accident also goes back several years. Some of you might remember when there were Yahoo groups on that were email groups, and there was one called Rails of Milwaukee. A fellow named Tom Manns, a very well-known rail historian and a member of the Chicago Northwestern Historical Society, posted a question. He said, the Wisconsin State Historical Society website talks about an accident in South Milwaukee, Wisconsin on November 15th, 1907, where a fast train plowed into a group of workmen, killing 6, injuring others, some of whom died later. Now, I knew nothing of this accident. I obviously was not around in 1907. Oh, yeah. Well, I was not aware in 1907. But my grandmother and her sister and all of their friends would meet, and all they talked about was how people died. But they never talked about this accident. And I have, to my knowledge, every history of South Milwaukee that's been published, and there's nothing about it, even though memorable fist fights are mentioned in these histories. So I started to do a little bit of research, and fortunately, this was in an era before newspaper archives were put behind paywalls. So I was able to uncover a fair amount of stuff, but there were still conflicting reports. One thing that quickly became obvious is that the Wisconsin State Historical Society had the date wrong. It wasn't November 15th, it was November 13th, 1907. We're standing at the place where the accident occurred. This is Milwaukee Avenue, the major, if you want to call it, business district of South Milwaukee, crossing, well, it was the Union Pacific when I took this picture, but it was the Chicago Northwestern when the incident occurred. This is the same old line, the 1855 old line of the Chicago Northwestern that featured in Chris Barney's incident in St. Francis. And it was, as it was in at the time of Chris's accident, well, Chris's story, a double track main. It's now single tracked. There are sidewalks on both sides of Milwaukee Avenue, and both sides of the street feature in this accident. So here we are looking at a aerial drawing, probably taken from the top of the South Milwaukee water tank, of what South Milwaukee more or less looked like in 1907. We are standing, or rather we're flying like a bird right over Milwaukee Avenue. In the right-hand quadrant of the drawing, you can see the South Milwaukee Depot, an 1892 drawing, the depot from the famous railroad depot architect Charles Sumner Frost. In the sort of the left-hand portion of the center of the photo is the Bucyrus Steam Shovel and Dredge Company, later to become Bucyrus Erie, which is where the workmen who died all worked. Coming from the factory is 11th Avenue. The workers, having left their 6 p.m. shift, would have walked south on 11th. They would have reached the corner of 11th and Milwaukee, and they would have turned due west and to cross the railroad tracks. Just barely visible to the far right of this drawing, and not marked as such, is Rawson Avenue. Rawson Avenue is a few blocks north of Milwaukee Avenue and features again in the facts behind this incident or accident. I'm standing where the now removed southbound or Railroad East main line would have been coming through South Milwaukee in 1907. And in fact, it was still there right through the 1980s, but was taken out early in the 1980s because of a lack of traffic needing double track main line. I'm now standing on the sidewalk on the other side of the street, the south side of the street. And you can, once again, you can see some gravel where the the other main line, now removed, used to be. The workman who died would have been on the sidewalk on the other side of the street, the north side of the street. Other pedestrians were also right here where I'm standing on the south side of the street. Here is the South Milwaukee Depot showing the double track main line and that there are platforms on, oops, we got happy fingers there. And there are platforms on both sides of the track. Again, the depot was built in 1892. I would date this postcard to not too far off from the date of the incident, 1907. The color is obviously hand colored. It's not a color photograph, but that is roughly the color of the brick. The depot still stands and is used by Benkowski Builders, so you can drive by this depot today. Because the Northwestern is a left-hand running railroad, this 1968 photo taken by William Strauss showing a eastbound, meaning southbound, passenger train is on the easternmost track. The train that hit the workman, and I guess I've given away the story, but the train that hit the workman would have been taking this track. This is a northbound railroad westbound passenger train, also 1968, and also a William Strauss picture at the South Milwaukee Depot, is where a train had been waiting at the depot and just departed prior to the incident. Here's something that has of no railroad significance whatsoever. I'm looking east on Milwaukee Avenue, probably around 1953 or 54, based on the cars that are parked. It was a thriving enough business district that there were parking meters. You would be laughed at if you proposed putting parking meters in South Milwaukee today. But the relevance of this picture is that the party that the boys went to, the newsboys that Chris Barney was talking about, is visible on the left side of the street in this photograph, kind of far away from the photographer, but it was a well-known ballroom and public structure on Milwaukee Avenue. So when those boys got in the truck with Mr. Voigt driving, they would have driven probably on North Chicago Avenue, which goes up eventually in a jog in the road. Packard Avenue joins up with KK to get to the St. Francis Avenue crossing. So it's somewhat related to Chris's presentation. Oh, geez, once again, my finger is too heavy. I guess it's overfed. Another relevant fact to why this accident occurred, at least as I've reconstructed it, is that north of Milwaukee Avenue at Rawson Avenue, there's a very considerable curve in the double track main, and that curve remains today. This train, the locomotive of which is probably just crossing Rawson Avenue, you can get a feel, even though it's a telephoto picture and a bit distorted, you can get a feel for the sharpness of the curve. I'm standing now at Rawson Avenue looking north, and you can see the curve. When I took this picture, the other main line had already been removed. A somewhat older picture, not too many years after the southbound or railroad eastbound main had been removed, where those rail fans / trespassers are standing. The grassy area is where the tracks would have been. You can see the curve, however. It continues through Rawson Avenue, and it continues on beyond Rawson Avenue, almost all the way to Milwaukee Avenue. I hope I'm making this clear for those of you who don't know South Milwaukee. That truck in the background is on Milwaukee Avenue, and you can see how close the curve approaches Milwaukee Avenue. This aerial shot also tends to make the situation clear, I hope. So let's try and reconstruct exactly what happened that night in 1907. It was after 6 p.m. and as we knew from today already, it would have been dark. I don't know what the streetlight situation was in South Milwaukee in 1907. Probably not too great. The depot would have looked roughly like this. This 1950s shot shows the sidewalk in place. This shot shows the Bucyrus factory. Milwaukee Avenue is hardly visible off to the far right. So the men have been working all day at the Bucyrus factory. Since they were getting off at 6, their shift may well have started at 6 in the morning. That was the day of a 12-hour workday. They came from Bucyrus and arrived at this crossing. They're unlike St. Francis Avenue in 1924. In 1907, there were gates at Milwaukee Avenue. They were not automatically triggered by the trains. They had to be lowered by a gate tender who had a 2-story tower there on the west side of the tracks. His name was well, I don't know about Jacob, but the Bruskovsky family are the ones who lived next door to my parents and built their house. So things don't change an awful lot in South Milwaukee. And so the Bruskovsky family was a very well-known family, members of whom I knew. The workmen would have seen a situation somewhat looking like this as they left work. This is the corner of 11th and Milwaukee Avenue. A close-up of that same photo, showing again, the gates protect both the road and the sidewalk. That used to be fairly common back then, that gates would lower to protect the sidewalk. Again, returning to that same picture, you can see the double gates. So Mr. Bruskovsky would have been in charge of lowering the gates. This is the interior of the Bucyrus factory. I don't know the year of this picture, perhaps the 1920s. One common thing for all of my folks' neighbors who worked at Bucyrus, and that was most of my friends' fathers worked at Bucyrus. They were all hard of hearing. It was a dirty, noisy job. So we can assume that these workmen who got out of work were dead tired from 12-hour day, pitch black, and they were deaf, or at least did not have perfect hearing. It's a dangerous, hot, exhausting job. They're coming up to the crossing. Of course, these are modern gates. And while there are 6 workmen on that side of the street, there were, I believe, 3 women and 2 men standing on this side of the street at the crossing. The gates are down because a train coming up to Carrollville, train number 327, the so-called Carrollville Scoop accommodation train, 3 minutes late, has been waiting at the South Milwaukee Depot, discharging passengers, and has just crossed Milwaukee Avenue. The gates again are down. This is not the Carrollville Scoop. This is the 400, but nonetheless, it is a steam locomotive on the very tracks that the Carrollville Scoop would have been at the South Milwaukee Depot, and departing the depot, heading north to the downtown depot, probably stopping also at Cudahy, possibly also the St. Francis Depot. And there may have even been a stop or 2 before the downtown depot beyond that. So upon leaving, it would have created a vast quantity of steam and smoke, further obscuring the view of the people waiting at the crossing. Even if it hadn't been pitch black, this is broad daylight, and this is what a steam locomotive looks like when it's just passed you by after a standing stop. This is actually from Berkshire 765. Here's a further complication. The Carrollville Scoot would have encountered possibly this cast concrete whistle post and would have been blowing for Rawson Avenue at the very moment where the Southbound Express, number 18, a fast express, which would not be stopping at South Milwaukee, was rounding the curve at Rawson Avenue and also blowing its whistle for Milwaukee Avenue. So the fact that they heard a whistle meant nothing. They would expect to hear a whistle because the train they just saw would have been blowing for Rawson Avenue. Well, there would have been a moment of intense confusion, and all of a sudden the train is upon them, and every single workman who was hit by the locomotive died. And the extent of the damage to their bodies was intense. Two of the men, the tops of their skulls were removed and blown off by the force of the impact. The entire accident site covered in brain matter. Several of the men were unidentifiable. Their bodies were so disintegrated. Only the contents of their pockets gave any indication of who they might be. And in some cases, those turned out to be misleading. But one is particularly poignant. They found a letter in the man's pocket to his wife back in Poland, telling her that things were going very well for him in South Milwaukee and that she should now make the trip over to join him. Yes. Oh, so here's the dead. Joseph Wachowski, age 52. Michael Walchowski, his son, age 10. He was a worker at Bucyrus. He was a water boy, age 10. Charles Kozlowski, age 35. Stanley Tamala, his nephew, age 25. Jacob Jashek, age 30. And then a man who, as far as I could find in the newspapers, I didn't go to the coroners for death certificates, unidentified, too mangled to be identified, but he was thought to be Adolph Bell because in his pocket was a ticket for a checked out tool in the Bucyrus tool crib that indicated it had been checked out to Adolph Bell. And when a delegation went to tell Mrs. Bell the bad news, Adolph Bell answered the door. And so obviously there was an error in identification. When the men were hit by the train, it sent body parts flying over to the people who were waiting at the other sidewalk. There were also broken crossing gate parts that had been broken off by flying body parts. There were 3 women injured. I don't know the names of one of them. There were 2 men injured. I don't know the names of one of them. One of the injured men, ironically, one of the few doctors in South Milwaukee, Dr. Nadig, who was the city health commissioner, he had broken ribs. 2 of the women were sisters. Mrs. Lauerer had 2 broken legs. Mrs. Fatal, Carolyn Fatal, had severe internal injuries. The others were not named. Well, a little internet search found that Mrs. Lauerer and Mrs. Fatal, who again were sisters, their maiden name was Botting. And the Bottings were people known to me to go to my folks' church, St. Mark's Episcopal in South Milwaukee. In addition, Mrs. Carolyn Fatal, the Fatal family was also known to me from St. Mark's Church, not Carolyn herself. But so acting on a hunch, I went to the St. Mark's Cemetery in South Milwaukee, which has been there since 1869, and walked every row, looking for 1907 deaths and looking for the Botting or Fatal, F-A-D-E-L, family plots. And I did find those family plots. Well, the good news is Esther Lauerer with the 2 broken legs lived on to 1921. At age 71, she lived a good long life. Her husband, Daniel, lived even longer. It was Mrs. Fatal who died, Carolyn. And she was buried with her infant son. The son had died several years earlier. Interestingly, there was no grave for George Fatal, her husband, and a 1911 city directory I have did not show George Fatal. It showed other members of the Fatal family. So I'm surmising that George, having lost his wife and his infant son, decided that living somewhere other than South Milwaukee made a lot of sense. This is kind of a funny postscript, but in doing my research for this story, I found reference to a 1914 book published by the Socialist Party of America called Public Ownership of the Railways. And that book maintained that this accident in South Milwaukee was a classic example of why the government should own the railroads. Well, it's kind of hard to see the reasoning. It was a protected crossing. The gates were down. The workmen crawled under the gates after the northbound train left. The crowd on the other side of the sidewalk, Fatal, Lauerer, Dr. Nadig, they were screaming at them not to do it, and they did it anyway with the results that you've all just heard. Hard to see, unless government trains were going to go much slower, hard to see how the Socialist Party had a point there in their 1914 book, but I guess if you have a point to make, you make it. You don't much care what the facts are. So 7 deaths in South Milwaukee, deaths in St. Francis. We need to decompress, and we're going to decompress with an incident that didn't hurt anybody, except maybe some feelings. In about 2014, a new truck facility opened up on Waterford Avenue on Milwaukee's south side, a little east of 13th Street, right on the Canadian Pacific tracks. So this was a brand new trucking facility, and probably they're still kicking themselves that they built it so close to these tracks. But a driver was trying to take his load to this trucking facility, had stopped because the lights were on at the crossing, and then he decided to make a break for it. Well, it was a big truck and it was very slow, and it made a break for it the way a turtle would make a break for it. And as you can see, the gate hit the top of the trailer and scraped along, making a very interesting noise, still scraping, still scraping. Unbeknownst to any of us, this was actually turning the gate on its axis on the signal pole. The gate is starting to lower, and if you look right to the left of the container, you can see the other gate is down. So finally, the gate is lowering. Fortunately, no cars or trucks decided to follow this imbecile. And the gate is lowering, and within seconds, I missed the chance to get a photo in Trains magazine. Because here comes Amtrak and they go by. Well, but the gate, in fact, was far enough pushed towards the track that it was going to be hit. So we called the 800 number that's on the crossing. Within a couple of minutes, we heard the dispatcher alert every train that he knew was on the line, telling them that they should regard the crossing at Waterford Avenue as unprotected, meaning the trains had to stop. A crewman had to get out. This guy is holding a fusee. And he was also holding the gate away from the locomotive. Otherwise, it probably would have rubbed against the locomotive or even snapped. So he's doing his job. This guy, this is number 8, and it was already hours late. Maybe it was even the prior day's number 8. I don't know, but it was already hours late. You can see how pleased this attendant is. And they're exchanging views here. Yeah. And then, of course, now, does that give you a picture for how much the gate had been twisted on its axis? Yeah. So that meant when another Amtrak came, that guy had to come out this time with a red flag. He had to flag the train through. And on it goes. Well, eventually the signal maintainer showed up. And in fact, Steve Rohde, at that time, the Canadian Pacific policeman, showed up. Many of you might have known Steve, now retired. So I was impressed to see how quickly the signal maintainer was able to return the gate to its proper orientation as being exactly parallel to the track. He just had to loosen a couple of nuts and then tighten them again. It did give me a chance to see what's inside the box, which is always interesting. But since he had not reported everything fine to the dispatcher yet, I don't know if this was the island job or the lake job, coming down to probably switch William Steele, they had to send a guy out with a flag. Here's the maintainer talking to Steve Rohde. And I'm sorry I took the picture in this perspective because I don't have any pictures of Steve Rohde. But it was an interesting night at Waterford Avenue as they had to again flag this train through. The maintainer ran the signals a few times. Everything was fine. He reported to the dispatcher that Waterford was now a train crossing that could be crossed at speed. So what are the takeaways from the two presentations you've heard tonight? Well, one is to be situationally aware when you're anywhere near a railroad track. The fellow standing right in the middle of the track is perhaps not doing a very wise thing since there's a steam locomotive coming towards him, but he is at least situationally aware. The person mourning his lost girlfriend, or perhaps a diehard actually trying to put slide film in his camera, is not so situationally aware. This is Davenport, Iowa. Those were the QJs, yes. That was for the steam festival. It was probably 108 degrees. That would explain why the guy might have fainted and had to sit on the rail for a while. Expect a train from either direction, even when you are on tracks which have a current of traffic, which in this day and age of CTC, there is no current of traffic. And don't assume that just because you got safely across the last time, that will happen again. And I guess the final message is, when around tracks, are you smarter than a 10-year-old? I hope you are. That's the end of my program. On behalf of Chris Barney, thank you very much for your kind attention.
Round of applause for Dave. Perfect. All right, thanks everybody for participating. We're going to close the meeting now at whatever time it is. Thank you to Chris Barney and thank you to Dave Nelson for doing a really excellent program for this evening. Thank you for all attending, whether live or in person, or live and in person, or via Zoom. Good night, everybody. Good night. See you next month. See you in a couple weeks for our October 19th slideshow.